Imagine receiving a letter written in your late wife's handwriting, revealing secrets she never shared, and leading you to uncover hidden truths about love, loss, and second chances. In this heartfelt tale, a grieving widower and a mysterious woman rebuild their lives through art, community, and an unexpected connection. What would you do if the past asked you to move forward? Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any updates in the future. The rain drummed softly against the windows of Eleanor's shelf, a quaint used bookstore tucked away in the historic district of Savannah. Henry Mitchell, a retired history professor in his late 50s, sat behind the counter, absently flipping through an old collection of Civil War letters. The familiar scent of aged paper filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee from the small corner cafe he'd added to the store years ago. Though it was a comfort to be surrounded by books and the echoes of history, Henry's days felt hollow. It had been 3 years since Eleanor, his wife of nearly 30 years, passed away, leaving behind a silence that even the bustling charm of Savannah couldn't fill. This particular afternoon, the rain seemed heavier, the gray clouds pressing down on the cobblestone streets outside. Henry glanced at the door when the bell tinkled softly. A woman entered, shaking droplets from her bright red raincoat. "Afternoon, Mr. Mitchell," the woman greeted cheerfully. She was Ruth Wallace, the new mail carrier who had recently started on this route. Her warm southern drawl and easy smile contrasted sharply with the grayness of the day. "Afternoon," Henry replied curtly, keeping his eyes on his book. "I've got something interesting for you today," Ruth said, placing a small bundle of letters on the counter. One envelope in particular caught Henry's attention. His hand froze mid-turn of a page. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable, looping and elegant, written in Eleanor's hand. Henry's breath hitched as he reached for the letter. His name, Henry Mitchell, stared back at him, written in the script he hadn't seen in 3 years. "Where did this come from?" he asked sharply, looking up at Ruth. She tilted her head slightly, her expression puzzled but still kind. "It was in the outgoing pile at the post office. I didn't think much of it until I saw the date. It's been sitting there a while, I guess." Henry carefully opened the envelope, his hands trembling. The letter inside was unmistakably personal, filled with Eleanor's voice, her words, her humor, her gentle affection. It spoke of dreams they had shared, unfinished plans, and memories only the two of them could know. Henry set the letter down, his jaw tight. "This is impossible," he muttered. His voice, usually calm and measured, carried a tremor. Ruth shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know how it got there, Mr. Mitchell, but maybe it's a sign? Sometimes things have a way of finding us when we need them most." Henry's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting this is some kind of joke? Did someone put you up to this?" Ruth took a step back, startled. "No, sir, I just deliver the mail." The room fell silent except for the steady rhythm of rain. Ruth adjusted her bag and added softly, "I'll leave you to it then. Have a good day, Mr. Mitchell." With a quick nod, she disappeared out the door, the bell chiming faintly behind her. Left alone, Henry stared at the letter, disbelief clouding his thoughts. How could Eleanor's handwriting, her words, her presence, have found their way back to him? The bookstore suddenly felt colder, the normally comforting shelves looming like silent witnesses to the impossible. Henry leaned back in his chair, gripping the letter tightly. His mind raced with questions. Who had written it? How could they have known such intimate details? But beneath the skepticism, a flicker of something else stirred, an echo of Eleanor's laughter, the touch of her hand, the quiet mornings they'd shared over coffee and books. For the first time in years, Henry felt the ache of his loss give way to a strange, fragile hope. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside Eleanor's shelf, a storm of its own had begun. The rain had long since stopped, but the lingering dampness hung in the air, wrapping the streets of Savannah in a quiet haze. Inside Eleanor's shelf, the warm light of the bookstore cast a soft glow against the muted gray of the day outside. Henry stood behind the counter, absently organizing a stack of newly acquired books. His mind, however, was far from the task at hand. The letter from Eleanor had been folded and unfolded so many times now that the paper felt fragile under his fingertips. He kept it tucked inside the drawer of the counter, where he found himself reaching for it during quiet moments, his mind circling endlessly around the same question: who sent it? Ruth appeared again the next day, her mailbag slung over her shoulder and her ever-present cheerful smile intact. She lingered at the counter after dropping off the usual pile of utility bills and promotional flyers. "Morning, Mr. Mitchell," she said, her tone light but cautiously polite. "Anything interesting in yesterday's mail?" Henry's eyes darted to the drawer, then back to her. "Nothing worth mentioning," he replied curtly, his voice clipped. Ruth's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "Well, let me know if you need anything," she said, turning toward the door. "Or if there's anything I can help you figure out about—" "I don't need your help," Henry interrupted sharply. The words hung in the air, heavier than he'd intended. Ruth hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Understood," she said quietly, before slipping out of the shop and onto her route. Henry let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The truth was, Ruth's kindness unsettled him. He didn't know whether to trust her, and the mere thought of doing so made him uneasy. Days passed, and Henry found himself withdrawing even more. His daughter, Claire, stopped by the shop one afternoon, her concern evident in the way she fussed over the bookshelves. "Dad, you're not answering my calls," Claire said, her tone exasperated. "I've been worried about you." "I've been busy," Henry replied, avoiding her gaze. "Busy with what? This place is dead half the time and you barely leave." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "Is this about that letter you mentioned last week? The one from Mom?" Henry stiffened. "I didn't say it was from her." "You didn't have to," Claire countered. "You've been acting strange ever since. Whatever it is, Dad, it's not real. You know that, right?" Her words stung, though he knew she meant well. "You don't understand," he said quietly, brushing past her to rearrange a nearby display. Claire sighed, frustration etched across her face. "I'm trying to help, Dad, but you have to let me in." When Henry didn't respond, she shook her head and left, the bell over the door jingling softly in her wake. That evening, as the shop's last few customers trickled out, another envelope appeared in the day's mail. This time, Henry recognized the handwriting immediately. His heart pounded as he opened the letter, the faint scent of lavender, Eleanor's favorite, wafting up from the paper. The words inside were just as haunting as the first. "Henry, do you remember the day we sat by the fountain at Forsyth Park? You said it was the perfect place to paint, but I never finished the piece. Maybe it's time for you to visit again. Love always, Eleanor." Henry sat heavily in the chair behind the counter, the letter trembling in his hands. Forsyth Park. It had been one of Eleanor's favorite spots in Savannah, a place they often visited during their early years together. She'd brought her easel there so many times, her brushes capturing the park's fountains and moss-draped oaks with effortless grace. The painting she mentioned, though, it had never been completed. Eleanor had started it during the summer before her diagnosis, but life had interrupted. Henry remembered the canvas propped against the wall of her studio, half-finished, before it was eventually packed away. He set the letter down and stared at the far wall of the shop, his thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and longing. How could anyone know about that painting? The next morning, Henry found himself walking toward Forsyth Park almost without realizing it. The air was crisp, the sun breaking through the clouds in golden rays that lit up the Spanish moss hanging overhead. As he neared the fountain Eleanor had loved so much, he noticed a familiar figure sitting on one of the benches. Ruth looked up from her book as he approached, surprise flickering across her face. "Didn't expect to see you here, Mr. Mitchell," she said, closing her novel. Henry hesitated before sitting down beside her, the letter clutched tightly in his jacket pocket. "What do you know about these letters?" he asked, his tone softer than it had been in days. Ruth's expression turned serious. "Only that they seem to mean a lot to you," she said. "I told you before, I don't know where they're coming from, but if it's bringing you here, maybe it's worth looking into." Henry glanced at her, his skepticism still present but waning. "And And why would you care? Ruth smiled faintly. Sometimes it's easier to understand someone else's grief when you've been through your own. Henry didn't respond, but for the first time he felt the faintest crack in the wall he'd built around himself. As they sat in silence, the sounds of the fountain mingling with the rustle of leaves, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor's letters were leading him somewhere he wasn't ready to go, but perhaps needed to. The morning sun dappled through the sprawling oaks of Forsyth Park, casting soft golden light across the cobblestone paths. Henry sat on a wrought iron bench near the fountain, the letter from Eleanor resting loosely in his lap. The sounds of laughter and chatter from joggers and families drifted by, but Henry remained still, his eyes scanning the familiar surroundings described so vividly in the letter. He remembered this place well. Eleanor had loved it here, especially on quiet mornings when the park felt like their own secret retreat. She had once set up her easel right by this very fountain, her brushes darting across the canvas with a confidence he had always admired. Lost in thought, he didn't notice Ruth approaching until she stood a few feet away, clutching her mailbag. "Well, this is a surprise," she said lightly, her voice warm yet cautious. Henry looked up, startled. "Ruth," he muttered, straightening. "What are you doing here?" She gestured toward her satchel. "Mail route goes through here, but I wasn't expecting to see you out and about." Her eyes flicked to the letter on his lap. "I take it the park means something to you?" Henry hesitated before nodding. "It does. My wife, Eleanor, she used to paint here. She mentioned it in the letter." He paused, unsure why he was sharing this with her. "It's the second one I've received." Ruth tilted her head, her expression softening. "Mind if I sit?" Henry hesitated, then gestured toward the empty space beside him. She sat down, her presence quiet yet oddly grounding. "Can I see it?" she asked, nodding toward the letter. He hesitated again, but handed it over. Ruth unfolded the paper carefully, her eyes scanning the neat, looping handwriting. After a moment, she handed it back. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Eleanor must have had a real gift with words." Henry's throat tightened. She did. They sat in silence for a while, the faint splashing of the fountain filling the space between them. Finally, Ruth spoke again. "You know," she began, "when I moved here from Atlanta, I didn't think I'd ever feel settled again. Leaving was, well, it wasn't my choice at first." Henry glanced at her, intrigued despite himself. "Why did you leave?" Ruth leaned back against the bench, her gaze distant. "Divorce," she said simply. "Messy, painful, and completely life-changing. I spent 20 years trying to make a life with someone who just stopped trying. And when it was over, I didn't know who I was anymore. So I packed up and came here, hoping Savannah might give me a second chance." Her honesty caught Henry off guard. He wasn't used to people being so open, especially with him. "That must have been hard," he said quietly. "It was," Ruth admitted. "But it was also freeing in a way. Starting over, rebuilding. It forces you to figure out what really matters." She turned to him, her gaze steady. "Maybe these letters are Eleanor's way of helping you figure that out." Henry looked down at the letter in his hands, his emotions swirling. He wanted to believe Ruth, but the weight of his guilt and grief kept pulling him back. "Maybe," he said finally. As the morning turned to afternoon, Ruth suggested they walk around the park. Reluctantly, Henry agreed, his feet carrying him to the very spot where Eleanor used to set up her easel. He could almost see her there, her hair catching the sunlight as she worked. Ruth knelt beside a stone planter near the bench, brushing away leaves and debris. "What's this?" she murmured, pulling out a weathered leather-bound sketchbook. Henry's heart jumped. He recognized it immediately. "That's Eleanor's," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He took the sketchbook from Ruth and opened it, his hands trembling. Inside were pages of unfinished sketches, charcoal outlines of the fountain, the trees, even the bench where they now stood. One page in particular caught his eye, a half-finished painting of the park's iconic fountain, with a note scrawled in the margin. "Finish this for me, Henry." He stared at the words, his chest tightening. How had he forgotten this? Eleanor had asked him to finish her painting years ago, but life had gotten in the way. Now, it felt like she was asking him all over again. "Looks like she left you a project," Ruth said gently, her tone laced with encouragement. Henry closed the sketchbook, his emotions too raw to respond. He didn't know if he was ready for this, to pick up where Eleanor had left off, to face the memories that both comforted and haunted him. That evening, Henry returned to the bookstore, the sketchbook tucked under his arm. He placed it on the counter and stared at it for a long time, the words on the page echoing in his mind. "Finish this for me." Ruth's words lingered too, her quiet strength and vulnerability stirring something in him he hadn't felt in a long time. He wasn't sure what to make of her yet. Her kindness, her persistence, her ability to see through the walls he'd spent years building. Part of him felt guilty for even considering the idea of letting someone else in, as though it would diminish Eleanor's memory. But another part of him, a small, fragile part, wondered if Ruth might be right. Maybe these letters, this sketchbook, this unfinished painting, maybe they were Eleanor's way of helping him move forward. For the first time in years, Henry allowed himself to consider the possibility. The next letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, tucked into the usual stack of mail Ruth delivered with her familiar smile. Henry hadn't been expecting it. After all, the last letter had taken him days to process. But there it was, unmistakably addressed in Eleanor's handwriting, her looping script both a comfort and a dagger. He opened it immediately, his hands steady despite the mounting tension in his chest. "Henry, do you remember the little wooden box I kept hidden in the study? I've left it where we spent so many quiet afternoons together. You'll find it waiting for you at the Savannah Public Library. Love always, Eleanor." Henry's breath caught. The wooden box. He'd forgotten all about it. Eleanor had always been fiercely private about her journals and personal items, and he had respected that, mostly. The memory of her placing the box high on the shelf in her study flitted through his mind. She had said it was just old papers, but clearly there was more to it. By mid-afternoon, Henry was standing in the grand entrance of the Savannah Public Library. The building was a testament to the city's love for history, its tall columns and arched windows exuding an air of quiet reverence. The librarian, a kind woman named Mrs. Keller, directed him to a private room where the box had been stored. "It's been here for quite some time," Mrs. Keller said, setting the box on the table in front of him. "Your wife was a lovely woman. She made it clear that this was to be kept safe until you came for it." Henry nodded, his throat tight. He waited until the librarian left the room before reaching for the box. It was smaller than he remembered, the wood worn smooth by years of use. He lifted the lid cautiously, as though expecting the contents to leap out at him. Inside, he found a stack of unsent letters bound with a ribbon, along with a small photo album. The letters were addressed to him, each bearing a date from the last few months of Eleanor's life. He hesitated before pulling the first letter free and unfolding it. "My dearest Henry, I don't know how to tell you everything I feel without breaking your heart. But I have to try, even if these words never reach you. The truth is, I've known about my illness for longer than I've let on. I didn't want to tell you, not because I didn't trust you, but because I couldn't bear to see the worry in your eyes. I needed us to keep living, to pretend we still had forever, even if it was only for a little while longer. You've always been my safe place, my greatest love. But I think you know as well as I do that there are things I've left unsaid. I hope someday these letters will help you understand. With all my love, Eleanor." Henry's vision blurred as he finished reading. The room seemed to shrink around him, the silence pressing heavy on his chest. He had always suspected Eleanor had kept things from him during her final months, but seeing the truth laid bare in her own words was almost too much to bear. One by one, he read through the letters, each revealing more of Eleanor's inner turmoil. She wrote about her fears of leaving him alone, her regrets for not being more open, and her desire for him to find happiness again after she was gone. By the time he reached the last letter, his hands were trembling. "Henry, I know you might be angry with me. Maybe you'll feel I robbed you of the chance to say goodbye properly. But please don't let that anger consume you. Everything I did was out of love. I wanted our time together to be filled with joy, not sorrow. If you're reading this, then you've already taken the first step toward healing. Keep going, my love. Keep living. Forever yours, Eleanor. Henry sat in the quiet room. The letters spread out before him like a map of Eleanor's heart. Anger bubbled beneath the surface. Anger at her secrecy, her stubbornness, her refusal to let him carry her burdens with her. But beneath the anger was something else. Gratitude, love. He was still sitting there when Ruth appeared at the door, her expression tentative. "Mrs. Keller mentioned you might need a ride home," she said gently. "You've been here a while." Henry glanced at the clock, realizing hours had passed. "I'm fine," he said, but his voice was rough, betraying the weight of the afternoon. Ruth stepped inside, her eyes flicking to the letters. "Eleanor?" she asked softly. Henry nodded, his gaze dropping to the table. She kept so much from me. I don't know whether to be furious with her or thankful." Ruth pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "Maybe it's both," she said. "Grief is complicated that way, but from what you've told me about Eleanor, it sounds like she did what she thought was best. She wanted to protect you." "That doesn't make it easier," Henry admitted. "No, it doesn't," Ruth agreed. "But it does mean she loved you enough to put you first, even when it hurt her." Henry looked at her, the vulnerability in her voice catching him off guard. For the first time, he realized Ruth wasn't just being kind. She understood. "I don't know how to let go," he said quietly. "You don't have to let go," Ruth replied. "You just have to figure out how to carry her memory with you, in a way that lets you move forward." Henry leaned back in his chair, the weight of the letters still heavy in his hands. Maybe Ruth was right. Maybe moving forward didn't mean leaving Eleanor behind. It meant finding a way to honor her, while also making room for whatever came next. For the first time since Eleanor's death, Henry felt the faintest flicker of hope. The days following Henry's discovery of Eleanor's letters were quiet but heavy. He kept the box on the counter of Eleanor's shelf, as though having it nearby grounded him somehow. The unsent letters haunted his thoughts, their contents replaying over and over. Each revelation felt like a step closer to Eleanor, but also a step deeper into an emotional labyrinth he wasn't sure he could navigate. Ruth had kept her distance for a few days after their talk at the library, giving him space to process everything. But Henry found himself noticing her absence more than he expected. When she did stop by the shop again, her timing felt oddly perfect. "Morning, Mr. Mitchell," Ruth greeted with a warm smile as she set a package on the counter. She hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the box of letters. "How are you holding up?" Henry sighed, leaning on the counter. "I've been better, but I've been worse." Ruth nodded knowingly. "Well, if you're up for it, there's something I think you should see. Something Eleanor would have loved." That afternoon, Ruth took Henry to a small community center nestled on the edge of the historic district. Inside, the faint smell of paint and wood filled the air, mingling with the quiet hum of conversation. A group of local artists was working on various restoration projects, repairing weathered murals, repainting old signage, and restoring damaged sculptures. "This is the Savannah Art Restoration Group," Ruth explained, as she led him toward a table stacked with canvases. "They focus on preserving the history and culture of the city through art. Eleanor used to talk about starting something like this, didn't she?" Henry froze, the memory hitting him like a wave. Eleanor had dreamed of creating a space for artists in the community, a way to give back to the city she loved so much. She had even pitched the idea to him once over coffee, her eyes alight with excitement. "She did," Henry said softly, his voice tinged with awe. "I didn't think anyone remembered that." "Well," Ruth said, her smile gentle, "I did, and it seemed like something you might want to be a part of." A tall woman in her 60s, with silver-streaked hair and paint-stained hands, approached them. "You must be Mr. Mitchell," she said warmly. "I'm Helen. Ruth told us you might stop by." Henry glanced at Ruth, his brow furrowing. "You told them?" "I might have mentioned you had an interest in art," Ruth admitted, her tone light but sincere. "I figured it couldn't hurt to introduce you." For a moment, Henry wanted to protest, but he found himself drawn to the energy of the space. The artists moved with purpose, their hands working to breathe new life into old pieces. It reminded him of Eleanor's passion, her ability to see beauty in things others might overlook. Henry began spending afternoons at the center, helping restore an old painting of Forsyth Park's iconic fountain. Ruth often joined him, offering quiet encouragement or sharing stories about her own foray into watercolor painting. Their conversations grew easier, more natural, and for the first time in years, Henry felt a flicker of connection that wasn't tied to grief. But that fragile bond cracked one afternoon when Henry found a letter tucked into the corner of Eleanor's sketchbook. It wasn't addressed to him. The handwriting was Eleanor's, but the name at the top stopped him cold. Ruth. He read the letter with trembling hands. Eleanor had written to Ruth during her final months, sharing her fears about the future and her hope that Ruth might help Henry after she was gone. The words were filled with trust and warmth, but to Henry they felt like a betrayal. When Ruth arrived at the bookstore later that day, she immediately noticed the tension in his demeanor. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. Henry set the letter on the counter between them, his expression hard. "Care to explain this?" Ruth picked up the letter, her eyes scanning the familiar script. Her shoulders sagged slightly as she placed it back down. "Eleanor and I became friends when I first moved here," she said quietly. "She came to me for advice, knowing I'd been through my own loss. I didn't tell you because, well, I didn't know how you'd feel about it. How I'd feel." Henry's voice rose, his anger barely contained. "You knew her. You knew about her illness, and you didn't think to tell me?" "I wasn't trying to hide anything," Ruth insisted, her tone steady but pained. "She trusted me to keep her confidence, Henry. I was trying to respect that." Henry turned away, running a hand through his graying hair. "You should have told me," he muttered. "I deserve to know." "And what would you have done with that knowledge?" Ruth asked gently. "Eleanor wanted to protect you. She didn't want you to spend her last months worrying." The words stung because deep down, Henry knew they were true. But the weight of Eleanor's secrets, combined with the growing feelings he couldn't ignore for Ruth, was too much to process. "I need some time," he said finally, his voice hollow. Ruth nodded, though her eyes reflected the hurt she felt. "Take all the time you need," she said softly before turning and leaving the store. The following days were a blur of restless energy and self-imposed isolation. Henry avoided the community center and buried himself in the bookstore, trying to sort through the tangle of emotions he couldn't untangle. Anger, sadness, guilt, and something else, something that felt dangerously close to longing. He couldn't deny the connection he felt with Ruth, but the knowledge of her bond with Eleanor complicated everything. He wondered if the tentative friendship they had built could survive this revelation, or if he'd let his grief and pride drive her away for good. As Henry sat alone in the dim light of the shop, Eleanor's letters spread out before him. He realized something. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but maybe that was the point. The bookstore felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of Henry's growing isolation. Days turned into weeks, and Henry buried himself in routine tasks, restocking shelves, cataloging inventory, sweeping floors that didn't need sweeping. He hadn't touched Eleanor's letters since discovering the one addressed to Ruth. They sat untouched in the drawer of his desk, a reminder of wounds he wasn't ready to face. When Claire stopped by one afternoon, her knock was sharp and impatient. "Dad, you can't keep doing this," she said, stepping into the quiet shop. Her eyes scanned the space, taking in the dim lighting and the absence of life. "You're shutting everyone out again." Henry didn't look up from the book he was pretending to read. "I'm fine, Claire." "No, you're not," she countered, her tone firm. "You're hurt, angry, but pushing everyone away isn't going to make it better." He sighed, finally meeting her gaze. "You don't understand. It's not that simple." "Then explain it to me," she said, her voice softening. "Help me understand." But Henry couldn't. The words felt stuck, tangled in the web of guilt and betrayal he'd built around himself. Claire waited a moment longer, then shook her head in frustration. "When you're ready to let someone in, you know where to find me," she said before walking out, the bell above the door jingling faintly in her wake. The same evening, Henry found a note slipped under the door. His breath caught as he unfolded it, recognizing Ruth's handwriting. Henry, I know I've hurt you, though it was never my intention. You've been through so much, and I should have told you the truth earlier. I'm sorry for the pain my silence caused. I need to leave Savannah for a while. My mother's health is failing, and she needs me in North Carolina. I hope you can find peace, Henry. Peace with Eleanor's memory and peace with yourself. Take care of the dream she left behind. It matters more than you know. Ruth Henry stared at the note for a long time, the words blurring as his emotions churned. He didn't know whether to feel relief, sadness, or regret. Ruth had been a steady presence, a lifeline he hadn't realized he'd needed until she was gone. The days that followed were quieter than Henry could bear. The bookstore, once a refuge, now felt like a cage. He stopped opening the shop on time, the closed sign hanging in the window more often than not. Customers stopped coming, and the silence grew deafening. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Henry sat alone in the dimly lit store, the note from Ruth in one hand and Eleanor's unopened letters in the other. He traced his thumb over the edges of the envelopes, his thoughts heavy. For weeks he had blamed Ruth for his pain, for the secrets Eleanor had kept. But as he sat there, surrounded by the echoes of his wife's dreams, a painful truth began to surface. His anger wasn't about Ruth or the letters, it was about himself. He had spent years avoiding the weight of Eleanor's illness, pretending that their time together was endless. When she was gone, the guilt of not recognizing her struggle had consumed him. Ruth had only been a reminder of that failure, a mirror reflecting the parts of himself he didn't want to face. Henry leaned back in his chair, the realization hitting him like a wave. He had been so focused on his pain that he had failed to see the gift Ruth had tried to give him, a chance to heal, to rebuild, to honor Eleanor's memory in a way that truly mattered. That night, Henry made a decision. He pulled out the letters one by one and began to read. Eleanor's words were raw and honest, filled with love and hope, even as her strength faded. She wrote about her dreams for the bookstore, her desire for Henry to find joy again, and her trust in Ruth to help him when he couldn't help himself. By the time he finished, the weight in his chest felt lighter. The anger that had burned so brightly was now a flicker, replaced by something quieter, understanding. Henry sat in the silence of the bookstore, the letters spread out before him like a map of his heart. He wasn't sure what his next step would be, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to take it. The shop was eerily quiet that evening, the kind of stillness that felt heavier than silence. Henry sat at his desk, the box of Eleanor's letters before him. He hadn't opened one in days, afraid of what they might say, afraid of the emotions they'd stir. But the envelope on top was different. Its edges were softer, its paper yellowed as if it had waited far longer than the others to be found. Written in Eleanor's familiar hand were 3 words, "For when you're ready." He hesitated, his fingers tracing the letters before carefully breaking the seal. The scent of lavender, faint but unmistakable, rose from the paper. His chest tightened as he unfolded it. "My dearest Henry, if you're reading this, then you've already begun the hardest journey, letting go. I know it hasn't been easy. I've always admired how deeply you feel, how fiercely you love, but that strength has made it harder for you to move forward, hasn't it? I need you to know something. My illness wasn't your burden to carry. I kept it from you because I wanted our days to remain filled with joy, not sorrow. I wanted to see your smile, to hear you laugh, to share the life we built together without the shadow of what was coming. But life, my love, is meant to change. It's meant to evolve. And so are you. You have so much left to give, so many stories left to tell. Don't linger in the past, Henry. Find joy again. Find companionship. Open your heart to the world. And one last thing. Remember the dream we once shared. The bookstore is more than a shop. You always said it could be a place where people come to create, to connect, to share their stories. I hope you'll make it happen. For me, for you. Forever yours, Eleanor." Henry set the letter down, his hands trembling. The words cut through him with painful precision, but they carried something he hadn't expected. Clarity. Eleanor had known what he needed long before he'd even realized it himself. She had loved him enough to let him grieve, but now she was asking him to live. For the first time in months, The weight on his chest began to lift. He stayed at the desk for hours, the letter resting in front of him, his thoughts drifting to the dream Eleanor had mentioned. The bookstore as a community space. She'd brought it up countless times, her voice brimming with excitement. "Imagine the stories that could come to life here," she'd said. He'd always agreed in theory, but life had gotten in the way. Now it felt like a call to action. The next morning, Henry walked into the community center with a new sense of purpose. Ruth was there working on a mural with Helen, her sleeves rolled up and a smudge of blue paint on her cheek. She glanced up when she saw him, her expression wary. It had been weeks since their last real conversation. "Ruth," he said, his voice steady but softer than it had been in a long time. "Can we talk?" She set down her brush and followed him to a quiet corner of the room. "I wasn't sure if I'd see you again," she admitted. Henry nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I wasn't sure I'd be back." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I found another letter, from Eleanor." Ruth's eyes softened. "What did it say?" "She asked me to live, to find joy again." His voice caught, but he pushed through. "She reminded me of something we used to talk about, turning the bookstore into a space for the community, a place for art, storytelling, connection." Ruth tilted her head, her expression shifting from cautious to intrigued. "That sounds wonderful. I want to make it happen," Henry said, meeting her gaze. "But I don't know if I can do it alone." For a moment, Ruth didn't respond. Then she smiled, small but genuine. "You won't have to." Over the next few weeks, Henry and Ruth began working on the project together. Word spread quickly, and soon the bookstore was buzzing with activity. Artists from the restoration group volunteered to paint murals on the walls, while local writers and historians offered to host storytelling nights. Claire, hesitant at first, came around when she saw how passionate her father had become. She even pitched in, helping to create a section dedicated to Savannah's history. On opening night, the bookstore felt alive in a way it never had before. The shelves were still there, but they were now interspersed with cozy seating areas and vibrant displays of local art. A small stage had been set up in the corner for readings and performances, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Henry stood near the counter, watching as the space filled with people, some familiar, others new. Ruth approached him, holding 2 glasses of sparkling cider. She handed him one, her smile warm. "You did it," she said. "We did it," he corrected, his voice tinged with gratitude. As the evening unfolded, Henry found himself thinking of Eleanor, not with the sharp pain of loss, but with a quiet sense of peace. Her presence was everywhere, from the walls that now displayed her favorite colors to the stories being shared by people who had once been strangers. She had given him the courage to move forward, and in doing so, had left a legacy far greater than either of them could have imagined. Later, as the crowd began to thin, Henry and Ruth stepped outside. The night was cool, the stars bright against the Savannah sky. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Henry turned to her. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" she asked, her tone light but curious. "For being here. For helping me see what I couldn't before." Ruth met his gaze, her expression steady. "You did the hard part, Henry. You chose to let go." He smiled, a real unguarded smile that felt like the first in years. "I'm glad you stayed." "So am I," Ruth said softly. As they walked back inside, the warm light of the bookstore spilling onto the street, Henry felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. Eleanor's final wish had been fulfilled, and in the process, he'd found the beginnings of a new chapter, one he was ready to embrace one step at a time. The days grew longer as spring unfurled across Savannah, painting the city in shades of emerald and gold. The transformation mirrored the changes within Henry's own heart. The bookstore, once a quiet refuge, now buzzed with the energy of renovation. Shelves were rearranged to create open spaces, walls were prepped for new art, and the scent of fresh paint mingled with the familiar aroma of old books. But something, or rather, someone, was missing. After the initial burst of activity, Henry realized he couldn't bring Eleanor's vision to life alone. Ruth's absence was a constant ache. Their last conversation replayed in his mind, her understanding eyes, the soft encouragement in her voice, and the unspoken feelings that hung in the air. Determined to make amends, he reached for his phone. Taking a deep breath, he dialed her number. "Hello?" Ruth's voice was cautious but hopeful. "Ruth, it's Henry," he began, his words measured. I wanted to apologize for how things ended between us." There was a brief pause. "Thank you, Henry," she replied softly. "I appreciate that. I've started working on transforming the bookstore into a community space," he continued. It's coming along, but I could really use your help. Eleanor believed in us, in you, and so do I." Ruth sighed gently. "Henry, I left Savannah for a reason. It was hard being there, surrounded by memories and unfinished conversations." "I understand," he said, his voice earnest. "But this project, it's bigger than me. It's about fulfilling Eleanor's dream and maybe finding some healing for ourselves along the way." Another pause, longer this time. "When were you thinking?" she finally asked. "Whenever you're ready," Henry answered. "But sooner would be better. There's a lot to do." Ruth chuckled softly. "Always the planner." "All right, Henry. I'll come back, but no promises beyond that." "That's all I can ask," he said, a hint of relief coloring his tone. A week later, Ruth stepped off the train and onto the platform at Savannah's historic station. The familiar scent of magnolias and salt air greeted her, stirring a mix of nostalgia and apprehension. As she exited the station, she spotted Henry waiting by his car, hands in his pockets, a tentative smile on his face. "Welcome back," he said, opening the passenger door for her. "Thanks," Ruth replied, her eyes meeting his. "It's good to see you." The drive to the bookstore was filled with polite conversation, updates on mutual acquaintances, remarks about the weather. But underlying the small talk was a shared anticipation for what lay ahead. When they arrived at the bookstore, Ruth was taken aback. The once cluttered space had been opened up, light streaming through newly uncovered windows. Canvases leaned against the walls, and the scent of fresh coffee wafted from a corner where a small cafe area was taking shape. "Henry, this is incredible," she said, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "I've had a lot of help," he admitted, "but there's still so much to do. I was hoping you'd help me curate an art exhibit featuring Eleanor's work." Ruth's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "She wanted her art to be shared, and I think it's time." Emotion flickered across Ruth's face, surprise, gratitude, perhaps a touch of sadness. "I'd be honored to help," she said. Over the following weeks, Henry and Ruth fell into a comfortable rhythm. Days were spent organizing the exhibit, selecting pieces from Eleanor's extensive collection of paintings and sketches. Ruth's keen eye for detail and Henry's deep personal connection to the work made them an effective team. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of Eleanor's lesser-known pieces, they came across a portrait neither had seen before. It was a painting of the bookstore, but with subtle differences. Brighter colors, open doors, people gathered inside. "She must have painted this when she first started dreaming about the community space," Ruth mused. Henry studied the painting, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "She always saw the potential here, even when I couldn't." Ruth glanced at him. "You're seeing it now. That's what matters." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to shift. The unspoken understanding that had always existed grew stronger, layered with new possibilities. As the opening of the exhibit approached, the bookstore buzzed with anticipation. Flyers had been distributed throughout the city, invitations sent to local artists and patrons. Henry felt a mix of nerves and excitement he hadn't experienced in years. The night of the exhibit arrived, and the transformed bookstore glowed with warmth. Eleanor's artwork adorned the walls, each piece telling a story of her love for Savannah and its people. Guests milled about, admiring the art, sipping wine, and engaging in lively conversation. Henry stood near the entrance, greeting attendees, when Ruth approached him. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair swept back, eyes bright. "It's a wonderful turnout," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I couldn't have done this without you." She smiled softly. "I'm glad I could be part of it." They wandered through the crowd, pausing by various paintings. As they reached the portrait of the reimagined bookstore, Ruth touched his arm. "She would be so proud of you, Henry." He looked at the painting, then back at Ruth. "I hope so, but tonight I feel like she'd be happy knowing we're both here, together." Ruth's gaze held his. Perhaps she would. Gathering his courage, Henry took a deep breath. "Ruth, I know things have been complicated between us, but working with you these past weeks has meant more to me than I can express. I'd like to see where this could go, if you're open to it." She studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "I've been cautious for so long," she admitted, "afraid of getting hurt again. But being here with you, it feels right." He reached for her hand. "We can take it one day at a time." She nodded, her fingers curling around his. "I'd like that." The evening continued with laughter and shared stories, the bookstore alive in a way that honored Eleanor's spirit while embracing new beginnings. As the last guests departed, Henry and Ruth stood by the doorway, the soft glow of the streetlights casting a gentle halo around them. "Tonight was a success," Ruth said, leaning against the doorframe. "It was," Henry agreed, "but it's just the beginning." She looked at him quizzically. "Oh?" He gestured around the space. "There's so much more we can do. Workshops, readings, maybe even a monthly community gathering." Ruth laughed lightly. "You really are a planner." "Only when inspired," he replied with a grin. She shook her head affectionately. "Well, Mr. Mitchell, it seems you have yourself a partner in crime." He smiled warmly. "I wouldn't have it any other way." As they locked up for the night, a sense of peace settled over them. The past had its place, but the future beckoned with promise. Together, they walked into the cool Savannah night, ready to embrace whatever came next. The bookstore glowed with a vibrant warmth, filled with the hum of voices and soft music. Eleanor's art lined the freshly painted walls, each piece lit by carefully placed spotlights. It was as though her spirit filled the space, embracing every visitor who stepped through the doors. Henry stood near the stage, his heart pounding as he surveyed the crowd. The grand opening had exceeded his expectations, drawing neighbors, local artists, and even strangers curious about the transformation of Eleanor's shelf. Ruth stood near one of the paintings, speaking to a group of guests. She was radiant, her light laughter blending effortlessly with the buzz of conversation. Henry watched her, feeling a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge fully until this moment. As the evening progressed, Henry climbed onto the small stage in the corner of the shop, tapping the microphone to get everyone's attention. The room gradually quieted, all eyes turning to him. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion bubbling beneath the surface. "This space has always been special to me, but tonight it feels alive in a way it hasn't in years. That's because of all of you, your support, your stories, your willingness to share this journey." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on Ruth. She stood near the back, her expression soft but unreadable. "There's someone I need to thank specifically," Henry continued, his voice lowering slightly. "Someone who believed in this project even when I wasn't sure I could. Ruth Wallace, can you come up here for a moment?" Ruth's eyes widened as the crowd turned toward her, encouraging her with smiles and applause. She hesitated, her fingers brushing against the edge of her glass, but finally she made her way to the stage. When she reached him, Henry extended a hand to help her up. She took it, her touch light but steady. "Ruth," he said, turning to face her, "none of this would have been possible without you. You saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. You reminded me of Eleanor's dream and helped me bring it to life. For that, I will always be grateful." The crowd murmured softly, their attention rapt. Ruth smiled, her cheeks coloring slightly. "You give me too much credit," she said quietly, her voice only loud enough for Henry to hear. "No," he replied, shaking his head. "You deserve every word." He took a deep breath, the moment heavy with unspoken emotions. "There's something else I need to say," he continued, his voice trembling slightly. "Ruth, these past few months you've been more than a friend. You've been my anchor, my inspiration, my reason to hope again." Ruth's eyes glistened, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak, but no words came. "I know it hasn't been easy," Henry said, his tone raw with honesty. "I've made mistakes. I've let my grief and fear get in the way. But what I feel for you, it's real, and I don't want to let it go." The room fell silent, the weight of Henry's confession settling over the crowd. Ruth looked at him, her expression a mix of surprise and vulnerability. "Henry," she began, her voice soft, "I never expected this. I never thought—" She paused, struggling to find the words. "I've been scared to feel this way again. After everything, I wasn't sure I could risk my heart." Henry reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "I understand," he said, "but what we've built, it's not just about healing. It's about finding something new, something worth holding on to. I'm not asking for promises or guarantees, just a chance." Ruth looked down at their joined hands, her mind racing. The weight of past heartbreaks pressed against her, but so did the warmth of Henry's presence, the steadiness he brought into her life. Finally, she met his gaze. "You've given me something I didn't think I could have again," she said, her voice trembling. "A reason to believe, but I'm terrified, Henry. What if we can't make it work?" "We will," he said simply, his tone filled with quiet conviction. "Because we've already been through the hardest parts, and we've come out stronger." A tear slipped down Ruth's cheek, and she laughed softly, brushing it away. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," Henry admitted. "But it's worth it." The crowd, sensing the intimacy of the moment, erupted into quiet applause, their support a gentle nudge forward. Ruth smiled through her tears, squeezing Henry's hand. "All right," she said, her voice steadying. "Let's see where this takes us." The applause grew louder as Henry pulled her into a brief but heartfelt embrace. The bookstore seemed to glow brighter, as though Eleanor herself was smiling down on them, her dream fulfilled in ways she could never have imagined. Later that evening, as the guests trickled out and the bookstore grew quiet again, Ruth and Henry sat on the steps outside. The night air was cool, the streets bathed in the soft glow of lamplight. "Do you think she'd approve?" Ruth asked, leaning against Henry's shoulder. "Eleanor always had a way of seeing the best in people," Henry replied. "I think she'd be happy we're finding something good in all of this." Ruth nodded, her gaze fixed on the stars. "I hope so." Henry turned to her, his expression tender. "Ruth, whatever happens, I'm glad you stayed." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. "So am I." As they sat together, the past finally felt like it had found its place, not as a shadow, but as a foundation for the future. The grand opening of Eleanor's dream arrived on a warm, golden afternoon, the kind Savannah seemed to reserve for special occasions. A soft breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine through the streets, weaving through the crowd gathered outside the bookstore. Henry stood by the door, the freshly painted sign above him glinting in the sunlight. "Eleanor's Dream," it read in bold, elegant letters, a tribute to the woman who had inspired this transformation. Inside, the space had been transformed into a vibrant hub of creativity. Long tables filled with art supplies stretched across one corner, while a stage in the back awaited storytellers and musicians. The walls displayed a rotating collection of local art, anchored by a permanent section featuring Eleanor's paintings and sketches. Ruth stood beside Henry, her smile warm and steady. "You ready?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of teasing. Henry chuckled, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. "As ready as I'll ever be." They shared a look of quiet understanding before Henry stepped forward to address the crowd. "Welcome, everyone," he began, his voice strong but tinged with emotion. "This space, Eleanor's Dream, is more than just a bookstore. It's a place for stories, for creativity, for connection. My wife, Eleanor, believed in the power of art to bring people together, to heal and inspire. This was her dream, and today it's ours." The crowd erupted into applause, the energy of the moment lifting Henry's spirits. He gestured toward Ruth. "I couldn't have done this alone," he continued. "Ruth Wallace has been instrumental in bringing this dream to life. Her unwavering belief in this project and in me made all the difference." Ruth's cheeks flushed, but she stepped forward to join him. "Henry's giving me far too much credit," she said, her tone light. "This space is a testament to Eleanor's vision and Henry's determination. I'm just honored to be part of it." The applause grew louder, and for a moment Henry felt as though Eleanor was there with them, her spirit woven into the fabric of the day. As the afternoon unfolded, Eleanor's dream came alive in ways Henry could never have imagined. Children gathered around the art tables, their laughter ringing through the space as they painted colorful scenes of Savannah. Adults wandered through the gallery, pausing to admire Eleanor's work, while others shared stories and poetry on the stage. Henry and Ruth moved through the crowd, greeting guests and soaking in the energy of the space. It was a celebration not just of Eleanor's legacy, but of the community that had come together to make it a reality. Near the end of the day, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Henry and Ruth stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The lamplights along the street began to flicker on, casting a soft glow over the scene. "I think she'd be proud," Ruth said, her voice gentle. Henry looked out at the people gathered inside, his heart full. "I think so too," he replied. "This is exactly what she wanted, a space where people could come together, share their stories, and find a little bit of magic." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as the crowd continued to bustle inside. Then Henry turned to Ruth, his expression soft. "This is a new chapter," he said. "Not just for the bookstore, but for us. I want you to know how much this means to me. Having you here, sharing this." Ruth reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his. "I wasn't sure I'd ever feel this kind of hope again," she admitted. "But being here with you, it feels right." Henry smiled, his heart light. "One day at a time?" "One day at a time," Ruth agreed, her voice steady and sure. The evening ended with a small group gathered around the stage. A local musician played a soft, lilting melody on an acoustic guitar as guests lingered, reluctant to leave. Henry and Ruth stood side by side, their hands intertwined, watching as the space they'd created continued to bloom with life. The journey hadn't been easy. Grief, fear, and doubt had shadowed every step. But as Henry stood there, he realized that those challenges had shaped him into someone new, someone capable of embracing not just the memory of his past, but the possibilities of his future. Ruth had found her way back to herself as well, her fears of vulnerability replaced by the quiet strength of someone who had learned to heal by helping others. Together, they'd built something lasting, something that honored the past while making room for new beginnings. As the last notes of the guitar faded and the guests began to trickle out, Henry and Ruth stayed behind, watching the flickering lights of the city reflect off the bookstore's windows. "This feels like the start of something good," Ruth said softly. Henry squeezed her hand. "It is, and we've got a lot of pages left to write." Under the glow of the lamplights, they turned toward each other, sharing a quiet smile that carried the weight of everything they'd endured and the promise of everything still to come.